Hi, welcome to my presentation. So, my thesis is titled Aesthetic Experience, a Universal Growth Model. So to start us off, I just thought it'd be a good idea to read my introduction. I think it says it better than I ever could, so I will start that. First, I ask you to imagine yourself. Are you picturing your outward appearance? Are you thinking about potential roles that you fulfill in different spheres of your life, like professional and familial? And then, eventually, do you start thinking about the parts of yourself that don't align with your image, but you consider flaws that need to be worked out? There are two things going on here. One being the mental account of who we think we are, which is often in contrast with who we think we should be. Being human already implies a lack of perfection. However, as a subject of Western ideology, the need to reach perfection is at an all-time high. The solution being a focus on self-improvement, which has manifested itself in the form of an entire self-help industry that capitalizes on these feelings of insufficiency and even exploits them. So then, instead of people finding fulfillment, they are actually identifying more problems that eventually will feel unsurpassable and invoke feelings of hopelessness. We need a better version of self-help that is going to be all-encompassing and not centered on the negative, and assumes improvement to be necessary. What does it mean to say self and personal identity? Is there a difference? Are they the same? We often ask ourselves questions concerning who we are, which is in reference to ourselves, where we use mental capacities such as reflection and introspection to figure out possible answers to those personal inquiries that help us reach a better self-understanding. Although the concept of the self has been contemplated by philosophers since Socrates instructed his disciples to know thyself, a rise in interest by academics and non-academics alike has recently developed, as the increase in newly published English language books that have identity in the title have increased tenfold since 2010. The evolution of the way we think about the self has transformed into this identity concept that is centered around the unconcealment of who we are. However, for the purpose of this paper, I will be using the term identity to speak of the self, but I am going to exclude the usual understanding of identity by philosophers as not changing. So then, a mature aesthetic experience joins the dualistic nature of our experience. According to Baldwin, mature aesthetic experience does this because an aesthetic object unites the two worlds. It is both a natural object made wholly significant and an idea perfectly embodied in a natural object, which provides the ideal situation where the self can find itself fully in an aesthetic object, while at the same time all the claims of the not-self are acknowledged. Here, Baldwin is bringing forth the idea that mature aesthetic experience gives the self, or rather ourself, the capacity to fully find itself in the given aesthetic object because we can both identify with that object or recognize that the object is everything we are not. In conjunction, Baldwin takes experience as the most encompassing fact of human life and distinguishes modes of experience from others in terms of the peculiar qualities and interests that characterize them, which is why I claim that it is through the aesthetic experience specifically, authentic self-growth can take place. Through the use of Baldwin's four interrelated notions that characterize aesthetic experience, immediacy, semblance, personalization, and idealization, I will be able to categorize every human experience and deem whether or not it is an aesthetic experience based on the fulfillment of those four characterizations. Then, building upon the model, I will assert that it is through the engagement in this type of aesthetic experience that allows for the individual to confront themselves and reflect on those parts which are known and unknown to them. So then, it is through the universality of the aesthetic experience that makes it possible to everyone that engages with it, which also makes growth accessible to all individuals that want it. Ultimately, truly engaging in the aesthetic experience will not only help individuals grow, but it will also jointly help everyone around them grow. This paper will explore different theories of self, which will serve the purpose of settling up the larger dialogue surrounding personal identity. Then, I will discuss different theories of aesthetics, which I believe are going to be the foundation in which we can authentically grow as individuals. Finally, using Baldwin's model of the aesthetic experience, I will highlight what makes a genuine aesthetic experience and also incorporate what I consider to be the degeneration of the self in this context that Baldwin's model fails to encompass. In conjunction, by adjusting and utilizing Baldwin's model, it will in turn criticize the self-help industry, as I am doubtful that every one of those methodologies authentically promotes self-growth. And if they aren't doing what they claim, they should be responsible for setbacks, or rather using methods that are degenerating the self rather than growing it. The self as a philosophical concept is multifaceted, So to attempt to encapsulate every piece of it would stretch beyond the limits of this literature review. However, I will be discussing the understanding of the self as identity, as well as the different duties we may have to develop it. Okay, so there you have it. There is the introduction, or at least an abridged introduction of my thesis. And so then I think the appropriate question to ask is, why self-growth? So, I think to sum it up easily, I recall our very first day of my senior thesis class. We talked about, the ideas, what we wanted to do for our paper. And at that time, it felt like such a huge concept to me. And I remember it all began with an exercise. Our professor instructed us to create a list of 5 things that we found interesting. And on this list of 5 things, I, crazy enough, put down self-growth. I think I just feel like self-growth is, it's pivotal. It's something that is for everyone. And so, I don't know, I remember writing it down and being, not even being, I guess I was just so taken aback because I'm pretty sure that's just not, out of all the interests I could have picked, self-growth definitely, it was just odd that it was on my list. But I have some other contenders like music and I believe even some politics, but self-growth won in the end. It's just something that I find near and dear to my heart, especially as a senior, finishing my undergrad, because I just, even as a first gen student, I've constantly struggled with, my own version of myself, and constantly questioning that and finding solutions and just, trying to decide who this self is in the grand scheme of things. And so then with that in mind, I then had to inquire, well, thinking of this self-help industry, that's supposedly centered around, us growing because of these 10 steps that they provide. But is that necessarily true? I don't know if we can really have a specific 10-step program that works for every individual. I don't think that can be true, which is why I push my thesis, which again is aesthetic experience. It's centered around the aesthetic experience, which Baldwin, like I provided in my introduction, has his own definition for, and it has those 4 characteristics that make it up. But also, aesthetic experience isn't just, I think at face value, we think of art, we think of aesthetics, but really the aesthetic experience can be almost any event in our life. As long as they fulfill those 4 requirements that Baldwin is talking about, it's actually, it can be applied to just about anything. And I think that's amazing, because we have experiences all the time that we, are working through, we are trying to process. But although I'm not saying that experience isn't valuable in itself, but what's cool about aesthetic experience is that it's a self-confrontation. Not only are you identifying the things that you recognize about yourself in that object, but you can also recognize things that are not yourself. You just bring so much schema to what you're already seeing, that you have all of this information and all of this knowledge that you don't even know about, that this aesthetic experience is bringing forth. And then within that, you can analyze it and reflect and truly see what so then it becomes this dualistic experience, because it's not just contained in one space. I feel like the definition is in the word itself, experience. We, as individuals, as human beings, we move through our life and experience so many things. And so to then be able to identify an aesthetic experience that can actually promote our self-growth, I think is one of the most astounding things. So being able to read about, Baldwin's theory of aesthetic experience, really enlightened that for me. And the fact that his model was more based in, initially he was also a child psychologist. And so he was able to, grow his theory from there. And it was first applied to children and, how children develop and how they grow. But then his later works, this aesthetic experience work, he talks about, how at different stages in our life, we can comprehend, these different types of experiences. And so he says that, once we reach, our most logical state, we can then begin to deconstruct these aesthetic experiences, because then we can understand them for their separate parts. And at that level or that stage in our life, we can then move from one stage to another. So not only can we stay in the logical stage, but we can move back to the pre-logical, similar to, your id, your ego, and your superego. They're just different parts of yourself. And so he argues for different parts of yourself as you're growing. And so then yourself almost, begins to develop and grow as you get older, which, links with maturity, which makes a lot of sense. But yeah, Baldwin doesn't necessarily say this exhibits self-growth, but I think that we can take aesthetic experience and change it into something, when you read my paper, it can, it encourages growth rather than hindering, which is my paper bases a lot on the critique of the self-help industry, because I believe that, it's just everywhere we look, there's books on how to improve yourself, how to be better, how to live the best life, how to be your best self. And you can even, you can look on Amazon and, one of the industries there is self-help. And at the top of the list, you find over millions of people have purchased a copy of so many books, to hopefully reach some sort of, fulfillment or actualization. But oftentimes you read those books and you're not any better off. Or if you are, maybe it's for a short time. But yeah, I feel like my hugest issue with these books is simply that, arguably, yes, mine is a universal model, because I think those smaller models aren't encompassing enough. I don't think we can limit things to, again, those 10-step processes. Rather, if we take experience on, a case-to-case basis and then determine from there, how we're going to work through it, I think is a more logical and palpable way to think about growth. And I also think that leaves the individualistic factor there, because unlike those books, those are they're set in stone. They are, you follow step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, etc., and you are supposed to arrive at some point. Whereas aesthetic experience isn't about arriving to some point. It's about being present and being able to reflect on exactly what's going on, which is why I thought it would be ideal as a growth model, simply because we are all experiencing things as they come. And to then be able to have this rubric to decide if it's an aesthetic experience, we can then maybe take those times and grow from them. So I'd like to leave some time for some questions. If you have any for me about my project, regardless, thank you so much for listening. I much appreciate it.